YouTube. I've got a list here, and I'm going to read through the top 10 lies that Christians tell. Now, first, I should probably mention this more applies to fundamentalist Christians than it would most mainstream Christians. Unfortunately, I live in America, so for us, mainstream and fundamentalist are basically the same thing. 33% of the Christians in this country identify as evangelicals, and many more are more fundamentalists, certainly, than what a European would consider a mainstream Christian. So let's get started. Number 10. There is a lack of evidence for evolution. Actually, if you look, you can find plenty of evidence for evolution. You can look at the fossil record. You can look at genetics. You can even look at archaeology to some extent, because even the human race has been changing throughout the time that it has existed in the archaeological record. And if you looked at common sense, I hate to mention it because Christians often lack it, you would note that small changes over time would necessarily lead up to larger changes, and certainly if you can micro-evolve, which most Christians even will admit can happen, over a long period of time, that could lead to macroevolution. But Christians ignore these things and a multiplicity of other evidence in favor of the Bible. Number 9, the Bible is a reliable historical guide. False. If you look at the stories in the Bible, you will find very little archaeological evidence that any of them actually occurred. There is dispute as to the things which happened in the Old Testament, and there's certainly a lack of evidence for the New Testament. That's because the New Testament was not written contemporary to the events which actually occurred. It was written at a later date by people who never actually took part in those events, the Gospels being written far later than Jesus' supposed lifetime. For instance, and for an example for the Old Testament, look at the book of Exodus. There's absolutely no archaeological evidence that there was ever a crossing over the Red Sea. There's absolutely no archaeological evidence in Egypt that the Hebrews were ever slaves there. This doesn't get mentioned by Christians. They mention all this supposed archaeological evidence without actually having any. And it just spreads word of mouth. Oh, of course there's evidence. It's in the Bible. It must have happened. But actually there is none. Number 8. Charles Darwin converted to Christianity before death. Also false. We have documentation by his child that the supposed incident, which has to do with a particular Christian woman who supposedly visited him around the time of his death, the reported event is that she converted him to Christianity and that he repented of evolution altogether. But actually, this person was reportedly never alone with Darwin to begin with, and that right up until his death he was coherent enough to continue talking about his scientific principles. Now, not that this would really matter, because Charles Darwin is just one person, and his religious background would have very little, I hope, to do with his scientific findings, but Christians try to cast doubt on evolution by saying Darwin recanted on his deathbed, and he actually didn't. Number 7, Noah's Ark has been found on Mount Ararat. This is a recent lie that has been spread. Dozens and dozens of expeditionary groups, usually funded by various churches and Christian universities, have gone up on Mount Ararat and claimed to find the Ark that Noah sailed. They've taken all sorts of wood samples off the mountain, and to every last one of them there is one common theme. They never allow a legitimate scientific institution to study their findings. They also never identify where they located it. Satellite imagery has shown nothing. The so-called boat-shaped indentation on the top of Mount Ararat is just that, an indentation. It's a canyon. It just happens to be shaped like we would say a boat would be shaped. And the story of Noah's Ark really doesn't make a whole lot of sense anyway, because we know from geologic evidence the Earth has never had a 40-day, 40-night-long flood. Despite what a handful of pseudoscientists have claimed, there's no reliable evidence that there was ever a deluge in that region of the world. That water never came up out of the Mediterranean, and rain down out of a huge blow spout. That never happened. There's absolutely no geologic evidence of it whatsoever. All this pseudoscience crap is just that, pseudoscience. So no, they have never actually found any reliable remains of wood or boats or human fossils or anything up on Mount Ararat. What they did find was a cabin that appears to have been used by people who were nomadic and traveling over the mountain range seasonally. Number 6, the Isa stones prove humans and dinosaurs coexisted. It's ICA, Isa stones. I think that's how it's pronounced. If you look this up, however, unmedicated individuals will notice that depictions in medieval folklore in particular tend to exaggerate the size and physical features of creepy crawly animals. Snakes become a garden snake of 2 feet that some farmer killed. I once saw a story on it from an English, I believe it was an English news printing from the 1600s, and it depicted a snake, and the snake was gigantic. It looked 20 or 30 feet long, and it was really just a story about a dude killing a common adder, which was probably 3 or 4 feet long. And it had a coxcomb and a huge tongue and fire coming out of its mouth. So to say that a bunch of ancient stones of dubious date and dubious construction prove that humans and dinosaurs coexisted because it appears to depict a stegosaurus and a pteranodon doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you look at creatures that exist now that look kind of like that anyway, like regular old lizards and cranes, and then you get people who, until very recently, were very unscientific in drawing things. So, doesn't hold water. Number 5, the sounds of hell. This is from the Art Bell show. You see, he claims that a caller sent him an audio clip of what happened up in Siberia. They were supposedly, according to the story, drilling down miles below the crust, and they found a pocket of hot air or something and lowered a microphone in, and they recorded a bunch of people screaming. Well, number 1, this event never actually occurred. It was a hoax drawn up by a Norwegian fundamentalist group. And then the clip, which you have probably heard if you've looked this up before, is actually a studio recording from a movie that was used as a prop during a segment about the Sounds of Hell story, which had been adapted from that Norwegian fundamentalist paper to an American broadcast on Trinity Broadcast Networks. So the actual recording you've heard is just a movie prop, and the story never actually happened in the first place. So this is debunked. It's officially debunked. Go on Snopes and look it up. Number 4, many scientists are converting to Christianity. I'm sure there are scientists converting to Christianity. I'm also sure there are scientists converting to Islam, and Judaism, and Buddhism and Hinduism, atheism, Satanism, paganism, Wicca, etc., etc. People convert to different religions. There is no solid empirical data that shows us that, yes, science is growing closer to Christianity. Actually, evidence shows us that as people go up the educational scale and get a higher and higher education, they tend to be more agnostic and atheist. Atheism and agnosticism makes up the majority of the PhD population. It doesn't make up nearly the majority of the mainstream population in the Western world. Generally speaking, the more intelligent a person is, the more correlated they are to not believing in organized religion. There are plenty of deists and there are plenty of agnostics, but as for fundamentalist organized religion members, not very many. So actually, this is also false. Number 3, the existence of Jesus is indisputable. Also false. There is dispute over whether Jesus actually existed in the first place. We get this dispute from the fact that the earliest books which mention Jesus are from up to 50 or 60 years after he supposedly died. Now, I would think that if a person was walking on water and rising from the dead and raising other people from the dead and doing all of these wonderful things Jesus supposedly did, that somebody during his lifetime would have written something about him that would have been preserved. If not in folklore in the regional area, then even in the world at large. Somebody that interesting would have spread far beyond the walls of Judea into the Mediterranean basin at large within several years. It wouldn't have taken decades for him to be written about by anybody. There were historians in that region during the supposed time of his life which failed to write about his existence. Why is that? If he was doing these miracles and he was being spread wide and far in that region, somebody would have written about him during his lifetime. Why didn't the Roman historians do that? It's because there is a very real possibility that what we consider Jesus is a conglomerated fable derived from a teacher of Judaism, who would be the actual person Jesus, mixed with all sorts of tales spun about him by other people after he already died. He may not have even been crucified. There is no historical virtue to a very large part of the Jesus story, especially when you ignore some of the books that were originally in Christianity that weren't included in the KJV canon. Number 2, the present KJV is an accurate representation of an inclusive Christian canon. Again, there are dozens and dozens of books that were near and dear to early Christians, along with the books that we have in the Bible now, that were not included in the King James Version of the Bible and aren't included in many versions of the Bible. Things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Book of Enoch. All of these different books were left out of the Bible canon, and they were chosen to do so at the Council of Nicaea, which was a Catholic thing. And the reason why a lot of these seem to have been left out is, number one, a lot of them depict Jesus as less than a perfect person, and more as a teacher or philosopher than as a god. And modern Christians say, well, then of course you shouldn't include that in the Bible, because they've been tainted by the fact that those books weren't included in the first place, so their upbringing was to believe that Jesus is a messianic figure, when in reality, theologians the world over are starting to realize, actually, if you look at the books and you reevaluate them for which ones really honestly seem legitimate, it seems he wasn't really meant to be a messianic figure. And a lot of the books were left out because they depict females in a better light than the church did. They empowered females, and that wasn't okay during those times. There were books that were left out because they were too confrontational towards authority figures, which makes sense, because if you look at the life and history of Jesus as reported in the present Bible, you get the sense that he really didn't like society very much. You get the sense he really didn't like authority, that whoever this person is, whether he was a teacher or a messiah or whatever, really didn't like authority figures in the ancient world very much, and was very skeptical of organized religion. You don't get that sense as much as you would if the books that were left out were included, and they were left out for that reason. And the number one lie told by and to Christians. The book of Revelation refers to the end of the world at some future date. This is probably the biggest lie in Christianity. The reason this is a lie is simple. If you look at it from a theological perspective, it's purely wrong. The book of Revelation was written symbolically to represent ancient Rome and Nero Caesar, whose name just coincidentally happens to add to 666. If you read the book in the context of the time in which it was written, which was during the reign of the tyrannical emperors of Rome, who put down the Christian and Jewish populaces immensely, and you look at it and you compare it to those times, you see dozens and dozens of parallels between what was happening historically during that period and what was written in Revelation. It was not written to represent the end of the world at all, and I would point out to you Christians, if you look in the Bible and you look at what Jesus said, he told you, according to the books that are already in there, that the world would pass away before the present generation was done. So why didn't the end of the world come during the generation of Jesus? Maybe he wasn't talking about the end of the world and he was talking metaphorically. But Christians like to cherry pick, and they like to point out that, oh, the Bible isn't metaphorical, except for the parts I don't like. Those are metaphors. Everything else is the grace of God shining down from heaven to everybody. And that's a problem, because it doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. So those are the top 10 lies of Christianity. Not all Christians tell them, not all Christians believe in them, but it is a facet of mainstream Christianity, and to a much greater degree, fundamentalist Christianity. So arm yourselves against lies, know the truth. You can look any of these up online and you'll find plenty of evidence. You'll find the fact that there are no pyramids mentioning the internment of the Jews during the Exodus period. You'll find the Isa stones are nothing but an ill-begotten hoax. And you'll find Revelation is agreed by 99% of theologians to be representative of ancient Rome and not written at all about the future at all.